Welcome to Conversations in the spirit of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody and Margaret Fuller Ossily. I am the Reverend Dr. Deborah Pope Lance. I serve as an affiliate minister at the First Parish Unitarian Universalist Church in Wayland, Massachusetts, and work outside the congregation as a consultant with clergy and congregations that have been impacted by clergy misconduct. I am joined in these conversations by the Reverend Gail Seavey. Gail is minister of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville, Tennessee. These conversations were inspired by two Berry Street essays, each delivered by each of us at the Ministerial Conference of Berry Street, the longest continuous lecture series in North America, founded in 1820 by the Reverend William Ellery Channing. Gail's 2016 essay, If Our Secrets Define Us, called for an end to secrecy and the necessity of transparency in holding clergy accountable for professional abuses of their power and their authority. And my 2011 essay, Whence We Come and How and Whither, called attention to how our ministerial colleagues' failure to come to consensus about ethical standards, and how this failure has allowed clergy to abuse their power, to harm individuals, to threaten our congregation's viability, and to sully our profession. Today's, conversation is a part of a series of three that Gail and I are having with the three women who are running for the presidency of the Unitarian Universalist Association. The Reverend Jean Pupke and the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, and our guest today, the lead minister of the Morristown Unitarian Fellowship in Morristown, New Jersey, the Reverend Alison Miller. Welcome, Alison. I should also say that the videos of each of these candidates' conversations will be put on my website, that's deborahpopelance.com, no hyphen, and linked from my Facebook page sometime by June 1st, when we think that we will have completed all three of them and can put them up all together. Alison, thank you. Thank you for being with us today, for your willingness to speak with us about the continuing challenge of responding to clergy misconduct. Gail and I are using the same 5 questions with each of the candidates as a guide to our conversation. I'm sure we'll depart from them some, but let's see where these take us. Gail, I think you have the first question.
Yes, Alison, can you tell us how you first became aware of clergy sexual misconduct?
Well, first, let me just say thank you for inviting me into this really important conversation. And I know personally how important this conversation is, in part in terms of my response to this question. The first time I became aware of clergy misconduct was when I was a teenager, when I was 16 in my own home congregation, where I was also in the youth group and on staff. There had been a separation between the minister and the religious educator who were married. And it was soon disclosed that there was an affair with another married congregant, between the married congregant and the minister. And so that was my first awareness, was really right there as a youth, and the rippling impact that it had on our own congregational system, and the immediate divisions that were apparent, and the experiences of trust and anger, and really trying to figure out how to face and deal with this episode in the life of our community. And then later that summer, I was at General Assembly, and this was the time when the news not only about our minister broke, but there was also information breaking about another minister who had series of relationships in his congregation, something like dozens, and a third minister who had transgressed with minors who were immigrants to this country. So it was 26 years ago. There is no moment as a young adult or an adult or a middle-aged adult that I haven't had an awareness of these issues affecting the life of our congregation and showing a distance between who we say we are and how we act at times.
That must have been quite striking to be 16, 17 and having this blow up in the church that you had been a part of since you were a child. And here you are, a minister, having witnessed ministers behaving badly at such a young age. One might have imagined that you would not have chosen this path. Help me understand how you did.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, I think that, and I always am very attuned in the telling of when people have approached me about the story, because I've noticed there's a distancing at times. People want to understand how our minister transgressed, and the way they ask it shows that they're trying to distance themselves from him. And I think that being in the system, what I recognized and saw was that ministers, just like every other human being, have flaws and gifts. Mm-hmm. And that in that way, they reflect everyone else. And the really important issue is that the systems that they're working in don't collude around secrets and weaknesses. And rather, I think in a healthy system, the whole congregation complements, we're not perfect, right? Complements areas of growth, not colludes around true, deep flaws, and definitely magnifies gifts. And so I see in my minister someone who was a three-dimensional human being, who reminds me about the ways that I have to be mindful, that we all have to be mindful. And my calling to our faith and to our congregations is very strong. I've also seen us move out of very difficult situations towards greater health and a greater degree of wholeness. And I've seen the transformational impact that can have in people's lives. Yeah. So
it sounds like you actually get that misconduct can happen. Yeah. And having been around in what was that, 1991, that was still that was the challenge, that it was still not credible to believe that a minister would engage in behavior which was an abuse of his or her power. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is people would look right straight at what you saw up close and personal and say, well, no, that's not abuse. It's just the end of marriages, right? It's not abuse. And so but you, having been there on the ground, you really get that it's possible for someone to, for misconduct to actually happen. And some have thought, not only in this area of the association's life, that it's the inability to understand that evil can happen, that even I, a good person, can engage in something that's evil, unwittingly or cluelessly, and we have to accept that some things can happen even when we don't want to. Yeah, so you got that on the ground, and it took the rest of us 26 years. Anyway. So, what do you think the impact of clergy misconduct is on our congregations and on our association?
Well, there's so much to respond to that, but what I will say is that I I think it's large, and by that I mean widespread. One of the things we talk about in congregations themselves is looking at patterns around boundaries that are set up, repeating patterns that oftentimes ministers misconduct in the context of a congregation that may already be wrestling with boundaries. And also that experience of misconducting sets up a system where boundaries are an issue. As a candidate for president, I stand back and I look at the 1,000+ congregations and covenanted communities, and I see a repeating pattern. I think there's something like, you have the numbers at your fingertips, but I've heard two things. Number one, that someone tried to track stories and stopped at 400.
That's true.
And number two, I think the other one I've heard is about 2/3 of our congregations have that as part of their history. So I would say that one impact to name is that it's widespread. And my personal story, which is, I would say, as I said, very three-dimensional. So I'm present to the human beings that are part of the story, but I'm also present that my experience of General Assembly changed in 1991, and that I've never been able to be at a General Assembly without people wanting to process the story. And so I recognized that not only was my community affected, and it rippled out to other Unitarian Universalists across the faith, and then that our inability to set certain kinds of boundaries and point towards what repair looks like means that it encourages what's the culture of the Unitarian Universalist Association across all of our congregations and at the UUA itself, because I see it. I mean, 2/3 or 400 is a pattern. So I would say it's large and widespread. And the second thing that I would lift up is that it's that it is long term. That many of us who entered our first ministries have talked about how the first 5 years were about really partnering with the congregation to set healthy boundaries, and not necessarily knowing at first whether there was a history of misconduct in the congregation, but sensing that that there was a problem around setting boundaries with bullies or secrecy around money or other ways that it manifested. And I think sometimes we're not following a misconductor. Sometimes we're following a couple of ministers before the misconductor. And then I'll say the other thing is, so often it's newer ministers who wind up in these congregations because seasoned ministers may have other options and look away from a healthy congregation. And so that's another impact, which is not only a generational impact, but because we're not always looking carefully, we may not even send in the people that are most equipped to help turn the community towards greater health. And I guess I'll say that for now, but obviously there's more impact than that.
Well, and what you mentioned reminds me of the newborn bards of the Holy Spirit, who've been a minister for 15 minutes, and they're in this highly challenging congregation that's marginal, that's not paying very well, that has, as you say, all the boundary violating behaviors in its culture, and yet they, what I worry about is they think and others think that we need to assess the promise of this newborn bard by how well she does in this very challenging situation. It's hard to distinguish between, is this about me? I'm just not set out to be a minister, or is this something else? And I think that as a culture, as a professional culture, we haven't been able to tease those things out well. And some new ministers, are lost to us because of the experience.
That's right.
Yeah. So you have, there are an awful lot, as you say. So, what do you think needs to be different? I mean, what do you think needs to change? Is it policy? Is it culture? Is it, resolve in the leadership? Is it, secrecy? Is it more transparency, more accountability? What do you think will reduce the incidence of clergy misconduct and restore the confidence and trust to clergy, which is the ground of what their work? Without the confidence and trust, it's tough. What do you think it's going to take?
Well, so one response would be all of those things. But I will say, I think we've done some work around improving policies, encouraging transparency. And I do see a shift around culture, a willingness to name that this is happening. I think that's the shift between your two Berry Street lectures that I experienced, that in 2011, during your Berry Street lecture, Deborah, it didn't seem like the whole association was ready to name the degree to which this was happening. And whereas this summer, it really felt like people were ready. And I think that could be in part because of the culture we live in, that we were seeing, and while misconduct does not only happen with women, and certainly not only in heterosexual encounters, there was a kind of violence, if you will, abuse against language that our current U.S. president was using.
You're talking about his Billy Bush conversations?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that people were really naming their experiences personally, including experiences in the congregation, and ready to receive, Gail, what you had to say. But I think this question is really important because I've been thinking about this issue now for a very long time. And in my experience, it's ultimately leadership resolve that shifts the system. And I think the same reason that ministerial misconduct is so damaging around trust and around our faith is a mirror of why. It's that we often say for something to be successful in the association or in a congregation, if there's a minister, it needs to have buy-in of the minister. And I think that's a recognition that without leadership resolve, we're not able to achieve the changes that we want to create. And so if we have the entire association or a majority of the association talking about changes, talking about changing culture, but we don't have the power at the UU Ministers Association, the Executive Council at the Unitarian Universalist Association, pillars, colleagues who are pillars in our communities, and the Board of Trustees, let's say, of the association. I don't need to name every power person, but leadership resolve, then we can't push it forward. And I'll look at what's happened recently at the UUA. If the president doesn't have the heart to engage in a difficult conversation, mm-hmm. and is going to essentially abandon it because it's just too difficult, mm-hmm. and that's what this work is. Talking about ministerial misconduct is difficult work. And so we have to be willing to kind of go up the mountain together to then experience sort of the better feeling of healing, the downward slope on the other side. And I think to get there, you need the resolve of the leaders. And I also think you need a task force that includes them. So I do see an opportunity we have for a commission that really does the tracking, so it is less anecdotal, mm-hmm. and sets up systems in place that we hold ourselves accountable to moving forward, that the leadership of congregations in the UUA is also held accountable to in terms of progressing up that mountain. And then the other side, as I said, what does repair look like? We can't just disconnection, permanent, you've been judged. What about our care for the survivors after they have either been found to have a true claim or not a true claim? What about the misconductors? What does repair look like? Is there a possibility for repair? As spiritual leaders, we need to do that. But we have to be willing to do that hard work of naming, claiming, and changing the system first.
And as you listed all those different levels of leaders, I hear you saying that part of the resolve is getting alignment with that. So yeah, a commission is one way to get alignment.
I hear kind of an echo of the kinds of things are being said around race issues and white supremacy, and the resolve of the UUA to engage in mission centered affirmative action.
Right.
So
that really leads to that next question, which is, how does this issue relate to those other issues you have been forwarding in your campaign, and some of the overlap of that?
Well, so the echo was on purpose, absolutely. I mean, I think that the work around power and privilege that and role clarity, right? That we're engaging, and authority. What gives certain roles authority? What are the boundaries? How are they accountable? Who gets to influence and decide? What counts as transgressions or what counts as white supremacy? I do see a very much a connection there, and I also see the opportunity for a commission, not only around alignment, but around drawing in the wisdom of different professions. We need a commission that has mental health professionals, that has people who've been in a congregation where they've experienced it, where they have different people to lean into these issues. And the other issue that I really see this connecting with, two things. I've been talking a lot about conflict, even before the recent controversy at the Unitarian Universalist Association. I was talking about how one of the things that shrinks our congregations is conflict, not being able to handle conflict in healthy ways and sweeping things under the rug and waiting for that blow up. And I've talked about how we need to invest in lay leadership, continuing education, as well as staff and minister continuing education around facilitating healthy conflict. And actually, I even think surfacing it. We shouldn't just wait for conflict to happen, but rather, what are the ways that we can lift up the creative tensions that exist, as well as the deeper things in the system that we just hope nobody's going to catch on to when they're a newcomer. And so that process for learning how to facilitate healthy conflict as part of continuing education, I think really connects with this. I think it deeply connects with this, and that sexual misconduct is just one example. And that misconduct takes other forms as well. And then the other thing I want to lift up again, as a community of faith, I think we still have a lot of work to do around spiritually grounding and vibrant and alive experiences. So a question I hold for the Unitarian Universalist Association is, how can we have a team that's really helping us learn about multicultural, multiracial, multigenerational, and religiously inclusive worship, and creating a more robust team than the one staff member we have there who's actually going out and training. And I would add, in this case, what are the rituals? What does healing look like? What are the rituals we have? What's the meaning-making framework? I guess I'm concerned that we go through these processes and then all of the people that are involved are left hanging, and that we're not bringing to bear the spiritual tools for rebuilding trust, for the work of repair.
So,
or indeed we do, like congregations. I've seen congregations do beautiful meaning making and ritual through their healing process, but there's no way to share them, to connect them with other congregations.
Right, exactly. You're right, absolutely true. I think some interims, for example, as well as after pastors, have been very skilled at that. But again, we're looking at a congregation by congregation,
That's
not
right.
the
Exactly.
system. Like, how can we move forward together as a people of faith?
so are you saying we need to get congregations talking to each other, like those who've been misconducted in the past, and we need to get them together, kind of sharing how they've survived through that and how they've, what rituals they've done?
Yes.
Because that's not been an inclination in the past. The inclination in the past has been to keep them apart. And, they each have their own kind of dreadful experience and are variously disappointed with the help that comes from the UUA, because congregational polity is interpreted to mean we can't help you. It's really your problem. And so it sounds like you'd get more horizontal kind of connection between the people who are affected.
Absolutely. And so two things: not only driving a policy and practice procedures forward that are healthy, but using the tools of faith to lead towards greater health. And you just lifted up something else, which is interesting, maybe because long before I was a minister, I was I've been lay leader and many different staff positions. So I've sat in many different seats. And so I appreciate that power comes in many forms. So I've heard a lot of people say the UUA can't come into a congregation and do X, Y, Z because of congregational polity. But I think that does not actually lift up the power of influence, of setting standards, of reward, and of consequences, just to name a few. Yeah. And I think that in the convening role the UUA has, for example, there's a great power to influence there's the power to connect, as we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. We know that you're in a moment of despair. Mm-hmm. We'd like to introduce you to a congregation 3 states away who was there 10 years ago and who might be able to mentor you. There's a lot of power.
Team. A trauma team, really.
I think there are a lot of powers besides being able to run into a congregation and wag your fingers and tell them how it's done. Let's exercise these other forms of power.
And I've seen that actually happen.
And work.
And it does work. And one of the things that people most appreciated, for instance, when the Nashville congregation was asked to mentor some other congregations, was that it was a team of people who had experienced as board members, as lay people, as victims, as ministry, in all those different roles. And, you described something that I have seen be very effective.
Wonderful. I'm glad.
Yeah. And also a power, there was a great healing power when someone from the UUA comes and offers pastoral support to a congregation when it's at its lowest.
Absolutely.
So you name so many great powers. I just wanted that one. It made a difference to people, to be listened to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Storytelling is part of the healing process.
Yeah, and to have, people say we don't give authority to people at the UA, but they did, because it meant so much to them to be able to tell those stories to that person.
You're going to get that last question, Gail?
Yeah. Okay. So you've spoken some about how your experience growing up in also has affected you, but I wondered if there was any other experiences you've had, as a person who has worked and on all these different roles you've talked about, influence your views and actions and responses to clergy misconduct.
So, the answer is Yes, both in that particular system and in other ways across the association. So, so I also have had the experience of actually working as an adult on staff in that same system. And so really seeing what were the ways that the congregational relationships had managed to heal, what were the ways that there was still healing work to be done, and what were the ways that even though issues of sexual misconduct were not present, there were other there weren't places to take challenges around those areas of growth for the leadership. And when it would be raised out loud, there wasn't a healthy system. In fact, it would be silenced. And so how can a congregation actually continue to look very healthy and engage in really powerful ministry? All those players, even including the ministers who were there earlier, and still have unhealthy things happening that are damaging. And it's open that.
So one of the,
yeah,
not to interrupt, but what I hear is that two of the things that you bring to this issue and would bring to this issue as president, one is an acceptance that it's a fact. It happens.
Right.
And the other I'm hearing is that silencing conversation about the fact that it happens or that it did happen is really damaging to our institutions.
Right. And I would say that later on, Forrest spoke about this in his books, that he was drinking later on. And that when I was his assistant, I said that out loud, that he needed help and that it wasn't good for the congregation. And that was silenced. And so I think that piece could have shifted sooner. I know that in the at the association, when I worked there, and I can't reflect because I'm not on staff there, but the couple of years that I was there, the personnel practices were not always adhered to. And I think I had 4 different supervisors in 2 years and 5 different office locations. I mean, there was a lot that contributed that if there had been abuses of power, where would someone go? It was very confusing. And then I think there were also examples of exemplary supervisors and I experienced both. So how can we be really transparent around, and I link it to personnel because I think we always make this between ministers and lay leaders, but I think it's more complicated than that. I've heard stories from religious educators and other staff in the system, and I also want to look to the Unitarian Universalist Association itself and what are the ways that there's a misuse of power. And then I'll just share in my own congregation, how do we always put this, that there was a time when swinging was really big, and that affected many people and rippled throughout the system. So when I showed up there, there was a lot of boundary setting to be done. That was part of moving towards greater health.
So you know your experience, you've been places and witnessed firsthand some unfortunate circumstances that really give you a visceral understanding of misconduct and its impact on congregations. And it sounds like that will be a rich contribution to have a president of the UUA have. Is there anything we haven't given you a chance to say that you might like to say? We're almost shortly out of time.
Short on time, right?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just this. I mean, you alluded to it just now, but I bring, because of these experiences growing up, I actually have found that I'm someone that's not afraid to go directly towards conflict. And at the same time, because I've grown up with these experiences, I recognize that all of the players are human beings.
Yeah.
And so this is really about what does restorative justice look like? It's about, again, going back to that, we can have incredibly rich gifts to offer our faith, and we can also be deeply flawed. And what we ultimately want is a system that helps us to grow and learn and adapt as ministers to be able to continue to offer those gifts. And what we need from the association is also structures that really celebrate our gifts, but help us notice where are the areas of growth. And I think we need something all the time. I think too often we put together these commissions in a time of crisis, but we know, sadly, my internship was in Tulsa, so that recent example of one of our colleagues involved in something very challenging down there around child pornography hits close to home. And I don't think we can expect, that doesn't erupt in a crisis. Yeah. That's so complex. It's an addiction. It's so many things. We need to be poised to address this. Happens all the time. So what's the team in place, even at the association, to recognize and move that forward? And I'll just say one last thing. I worked at the UUA when the Catholic Church crisis was breaking. Yeah. And I think there were a lot of conversations, again, those distancing, how they're not like us. It's like, really? Because we're not human beings. And we really need to put in things that are in place continually for us.
Right. And that was a big debate in the Catholic Church, the celibacy vows, for example. What supports are in place to help priests maintain those vows? And I hear you alluding to what supports are in our system, both as cultural norms, as zero tolerance, but also as resources to help ministers, manage themselves in what is actually a much more challenging profession than we all admit.
And how are we creating a culture that makes it that they feel they can't come forward?
Right. Alison, thank you. Thank you for joining us for a conversation in the spirit of Liz Peabody and Peg Fuller. We really are grateful for the chance to hear your thoughts and on what we all agree is a very important and pressing subject among several that the next president will have an opportunity to really make a difference around. And thanks, Gail. Thanks for being in these conversations.
Thank you.
May they continue and serve to bring ethical clarity to the practice of ministry and greater transparency in all of our efforts to hold clergy accountable to what we know should be the highest standards of practice. Alison, we wish you well in the election, and we wish your fellow candidates well, and eagerly await the results, which come in June, but I never remember the day, do I? Is it the 24th?
It is. The 24th is the sort of the main voting day, and then that evening we will all find out. So,
well, we all look forward to that day. And those of you who've stayed through to the end of the video, thank you for being with us. We hope you'll join us again. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Yeah, take care.